All right, guys. So to kick things off, so we are going to talk about digital addiction, right? So about a month ago, right, in our first workshop, we spoke a little bit about digital addiction. So today we are going to kind of go into detail and also speak a little bit more about what we can do to control our addiction to digital devices, right? So yeah, so yeah, you guys can still see, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so to start things off, we need to first talk about what really addiction is, right? So addiction is defined as a compulsive action or a use despite harmful consequences. So what does this really mean? So when we talk about compulsion, it's something that's an urge, right? It's something that you're not in control of. And it's usually very similar to stuff like habits, right? It's like things that you do routinely. So even things like waking up in the morning and like brushing your teeth, it's something that you habitually do, right? You don't really decide each day to, okay, I'm going to brush my teeth today, right? So it's something you do as a routine. So even an addiction is similar to that. But the important difference between the two, right, between just an habit and an addiction is the fact that there is harmful consequences to an addiction, right? So addiction essentially is a compulsion on a habit with harmful consequences that you continue doing despite those harmful consequences. So like commonly when we talk about addiction, we talk about drugs, right? So even if you take drugs, like you use drugs actually in for medical purposes as well, right? So there we won't really call it an addiction. But when someone starts using drugs, despite the harm that it's bringing to their life, that's when we call it an addiction. And another important or another fascinating point about addiction is that when you stop using that particular substance or when you stop a particular action that you're addicted to, you would get these feelings, right, of unpleasantness, depression, and loss of like motivation, which we generally call withdrawal symptoms. So that's another way of talking about addiction. So to understand what addiction really is, you need to understand this process called conditioning, right? So that's basically how different things that you do, right, different actions changes the way your brain functions, right? So that's what you mean by conditioning, right? It's also it's essentially what causes your brain to be plastic. So neuroplasticity, if you've heard that word, it's basically things that you do that change the way your brain functions. And an important component of this is this substance called dopamine, right? So I'm going to be talking a little bit about dopamine. So there is essentially 4 things that I want to talk about dopamine, right? So dopamine has a lot of functions in your body, but relevant to digital addiction, there are 4 things that I want to talk about. First of all, it's euphoria, right? So dopamine is the substance that's responsible for this feeling of euphoria. So for example, say you win a prize, right? Or you eat something that you like say you have a bar of chocolate. So you get this feeling, right? I'm sure all of you all have experienced this, like a feeling of joy or a feeling of happiness, right? So that's essentially dopamine flooding your brain. That's what's resulting in this feeling of euphoria. But that's not all that dopamine does. It also creates a very specific memory, a memory that links that event to that feeling, right? So the feeling of euphoria gets linked to the action that you did. Like if it's eating a chocolate, so it links those two. So that very specific memory is also a result of dopamine. The third thing that you need to know about dopamine is that it doesn't stay in your body for too long, right? Like roughly in about 2 minutes, it gets removed from your body. And the fourth aspect of dopamine is that when you have an excess of dopamine flooding your brain, it can create tolerance, right? So what we mean by tolerance is that the amount of dopamine that you need. So when you have an excess amount of dopamine flooding your brain, then the amount of dopamine that you need to get the same level of euphoria that you felt before for something keeps increasing as well, right? So your brain becomes less and less sensitive to dopamine, so that things that actually used to bring you happiness might not bring you happiness anymore, and might not bring you euphoria anymore, right? So these are 4 things that I want you to keep in mind as we go through the presentation. So to understand how dopamine really works in your, so it's a very complex physiological process, right? So an easy way to understand how it works is using using the reward cycle, right? So it has 4 components: a cue, a craving, a response, and a reward, right? So to understand what each of these mean, let's use an example, right? So example of, so I'm going to use the example of cake. So we have someone here who is looking at this cake, right? So in this case, the cue is the smell or the sight of the cake, right? So that's kind of the trigger. And the craving is him wanting to eat the cake, right? He wants to know what it tastes like. So that is the craving here, okay? And the response is someone actually eating up the cake, right? So that's the response. And the reward is that he gets a flood of dopamine into his brain, right? So this dopamine that goes into his brain, what does it do? It gives him euphoria, and it also makes a very specific memory linking eating the cake with a feeling of euphoria, right? So now this reward cycle is not necessarily a bad thing, right? In fact, it's a very important part of our physiology. A lot of things that we do in our day-to-day life is because of this reward cycle. So for instance, take studying, right? So when you study and you have to, like, say, solve a tough mathematical sum and you actually get the correct answer. So there you get a small hit of dopamine, okay? Or you study and you get a good grade. Again, you get a hit of dopamine, right? So this is kind of what motivates us to do things and motivates us to study. And also this idea of delayed gratification, right? So to break down what that means, if you take a good example is reading, right? So I hope most of you all are into, like, reading books. So when you're reading a book, it's not going to be interesting right throughout, right? There are going to be interesting bits and there might be some bits that are boring. But what keeps you going is the dopamine hit that you get when you come to the interesting bits. So it kind of keeps you going even through the boring bits of the book. So this is what we mean by delayed gratification, right? So this is very important when it comes to setting long-term goals, right? When you have to study for an exam, for example, right? So you won't necessarily have dopamine hits right throughout, but it kind of keeps you going because you have this delayed gratification. And also the reward cycle is very important when it comes to developing good habits, like exercising daily or meditating daily. So like I already explained, habits also linked with they are closely linked with addiction, right? So even to form good habits, the reward cycle is important. So how does social media, right? How does digital devices really affect this reward cycle? So I would like to explore this with the example of social media. So here we have someone again, and someone is attending online school, and then his phone starts to vibrate, right? He gets a notification. So here the cue or the trigger is that notification, right? The sound that he hears of the notification. And the craving is someone's need to know what the content of that notification is. Okay, so that's the craving now. And so the response that someone has to this is checking the notification. And as a result, he gets the reward, which is, again, his brain being flooded with dopamine. So in this case, euphoria, the feeling of euphoria that he feels, is linked with a specific memory of checking the notification, so that his feeling of euphoria is now linked with checking the notification, right? So now what's the difference between these two examples that I showed, right? So when it comes to the cake, there are certain factors that are external that kind of control it, right? Like, so when you eat cake, like, you might feel full and your stomach might send a signal to your brain to tell your brain that, it's full, so that you would actually stop eating any more cake. And there's also the problem of availability, right? You won't have cake at your house every single day. So there's a problem of availability, and the cake itself is a limited resource. Like, you have one cake, you eat it, it finishes, right? But these problems don't really affect something like social media, because it's freely available, it's unlimited. And even though later on you might feel badly about using too much of social media, when you're in the moment and you're using social media, you don't really feel full. So what this results in essentially is a situation like this, right? So someone here, he checks a notification and then he gets a dopamine hit. And then what happens is it tells him that, it links the two, the feeling of euphoria with checking the notifications. So someone keeps checking more notifications, he keeps scrolling on social media, and it forms this vicious cycle. And what, as a result of that, the brain gets flooded with a lot of dopamine, and it leads to that tolerance that we spoke about. And so the moment the dopamine in the body starts getting rid of the dopamine, someone starts to feel all of those withdrawal effects that we spoke of, right? He starts feeling depressed, maybe he starts feeling really bored. And so what he does is he goes back onto his device and starts checking more notifications, right? So it keeps continuing this vicious cycle. So so in the beginning I spoke about how when it comes to addiction, like, it's not just a habit, it's not just something that gets linked to the reward cycle, but it also needs to have harmful consequences, right? So what are the harmful consequences of digital addiction? So like I already explained, the first consequence is a loss of motivation, right? Because this reward cycle that we spoke of is very important for you being motivated to do things. So when digital devices take over this cycle, you kind of lose your ability for things like delayed gratification, which is very important for you to be motivated to do things. And also it can lead to depression, right? So what we spoke about when it comes to tolerance, so the dopamine that's needed for you to feel the same level of euphoria keeps increasing, so that daily things, right, normal activities that used to bring you happiness, like maybe going out and playing, or like, spending time with your dog, or maybe even reading a book, those kind of activities suddenly don't bring as much fulfillment and happiness, so that you start feeling depressed. And also digital addiction kind of changes the way you look at time, right? So it can, for one thing, like the time that you spend on social media and on digital devices kind of takes away the time that you can spend on other things like studying and other important aspects in your life, like even spending time with the people you love. And it kind of makes you feel that you're always busy, and that you have no time to relax or reflect on things, right? And it also kind of changes your attitude towards time and productivity itself, right? Because the moment you get some free time, you feel like you need to pack it up with some activity, because even to just sit and be bored feels like a crime. So yeah, so that again is a reason why digital addiction can be bad. And also it can affect other aspects of your well-being, like the things that you see and read kind of changes, like we spoke about neuroplasticity. So things that you see on social media itself can affect how you think and how you feel, and you can have a negative self-image by comparing yourself with others you see on social media. And it can also affect your relationship with others, right? Because you might be so addicted to digital devices that you don't really spend time with the people you really care about. And there can also be so many other negative effects, like everything that we spoke about all these weeks, right? Misinformation, cyberbullying, privacy, all of these get compounded when you're on digital devices for extended periods of time, right? And it can also have certain negative health effects as well. So we kind of, so far we've spoken about how digital devices can actually take over your reward cycle, and how you can be addicted to digital devices. So the next question is, like, how do we know if we are addicted to digital technology, right? So the first aspect is that you yourself, or me myself, I'm not a really good person to assess if I'm addicted to digital devices, right? Similarly, like, so it's very important to externalize our assessment of whether we are addicted or not. So a good way to do it is screen time, right? So we kind of encourage you guys to keep record of your screen time, and I hope like you guys have been doing this consistently, and that's a really good way to assess if you are spending a lot of time on your digital devices. The second thing is the experiment that we kind of asked you to do last week, where you stop using a particular digital device or a particular app and kind of see what you feel, and look out for these withdrawal symptoms that we spoke of, right? Do you feel like you're really depressed, or do you feel like you have lost a major component of your life, or do you like feel are there like feelings of unpleasantness and extreme boredom, right? So that's another really good way to assess if you are actually addicted to digital devices. And thirdly, you can always listen to others, because people who look at you would have a better, like your parents or your friends would have a better, uh, would be better at telling you if you are addicted rather than yourself. So just to like summarize what we've spoken about so far. So we spoke about the reward cycle, which is controlled by dopamine, and why it's an important aspect of our physiology. And then we spoke about digital devices and how digital addiction can affect this cycle. And thirdly, we also spoke about the harmful consequences that digital addiction can lead to. And next, so we spoke about how digital addiction can be bad, right? So what can really make digital addiction worse? So digital addiction, like your devices controlling you, is bad, but what makes it worse is this, right? So that's Mark Zuckerberg, and he's controlling your digital devices, right? So to handle this, like I would like to hand over to Malin to take it from there.